Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online series, At Home Artists in Conversation. I'm Maryam Ohadi-Hamadani, Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Research Department here at the Center, and today I'm delighted to welcome Jagdeep Raina today to our conversation. So before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. And please use the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Jagdeep, and they will be answered at the end of the program. And we hope to hear from all of you. Now, over the last few months, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Jagdeep and getting to know his practice as well. And besides being an artist, Jagdeep Raina is an emerging writer based in Guelph, Ontario, where he teaches at the School of Fine Arts and Music at the University of Guelph. Raina holds an MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design and has been an artist in residence at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Madison, Maine, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, the Camden Arts Centre Slade School of Fine Art in London, and the Miriam Dawood School of Art and Design in Lahore, Pakistan. And next week, Jagdeep is starting a fellowship here at Yale, albeit virtually, the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration Fellowship. Now, today we're going to be screening O Lahore, a short film by Jagdeep, which centers its narrative around the Kashmir Gate in what is known as Lahore's Old City, Lahore, Pakistan, fortified during the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. And this gate once functioned as a threshold between India and Kashmir. Now, this is Jagdeep's first film, and Jagdeep, your practice is primarily centered on textile making, particularly in relationship to Kashmiri embroidery and shawl making, fukari, an embroidered textile from the Punjab, which we'll talk a little bit more about later today in relationship to your textile practice. So just a quick note on how today will proceed. We'll have our screening. First, Jagdeep will introduce himself and talk about O Lahore. We'll screen the film and then talk about the subsequent paintings and textiles that have stemmed from the making of this film and your fascination with the Kashmiri Gate. So Jagdeep, welcome, and so glad to see you here again. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your RITM project, if you'd like, and to give us a little introduction into your film.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I just want to say thank you to you. It's been so great to be in conversation with you over these last few months. And I also want to thank Courtney Martin for this opportunity, and Linda and Jane for being so gracious and accommodating and working on this programming with you guys. So it's a huge honor to be presenting this film at the Yale Center for British Art. I think I have like a personal connection, like many artists do, with the Yale Center. I went there quite a bit when I was living in Providence, Rhode Island. I remember the first time I went there being so kind of struck by Tilly Kettle's paintings and Arthur Davis and George T. Chinnery, and thinking a lot about like really kind of imagining through like a visual lens the history of empire in India. And so having this kind of film being shown at the center is such a full circle moment for me. So thank you so much. So a little bit about this film, O Lahore. It was shot and created when I did a residency in Lahore, Pakistan, last December. It was my first time back in South Asia after 14 years. And it was also my first time ever doing a residency in South Asia. And obviously, my family trip to India, to South Asia, was only ever to India. I'd never gone to Pakistan before, although my roots, like millions of other families, come from Pakistan. And after Britain's relinquishing of control, India being decolonized, like millions and millions of families, my family was also kind of caught up in the kind of violent migration that happened and fleeing what is now kind of considered Pakistan. And so going to Lahore was a really kind of surreal, kind of out-of-body experience for me. And visiting the Kashmir Gate was something that the gate had such a pull over me in so many ways. I kept going there over and over again. And the artists I was with during the residency, they took me there a bunch of times, and then I went there again a third time to just visit it. And that residency really kind of gave me the permission to step outside of my comfort zone and think about expanding my skill set and thinking about video and film and writing. And so the final time I went to the gate, I photographed it, and then I brought a tripod with me, and I just started kind of documenting what the gate kind of signified for me. And in many ways, I kind of thought about as like the gate once functioning as a threshold, like leading straight into undivided Kashmir before India's colonization and ongoing imperialist policies in Kashmir. And I was also kind of quite stunned to kind of hear that it's one of the only remaining gates that wasn't destroyed by the British during the rule of the empire. And I think on a more personal note too, standing in front of the gate was a very out of body experience for me, just to know that if I kept going straight, I would have ended up right at my grandfather's village in Muzaffarabad, Chakoti, which is now controlled, that's a part of Kashmir that's controlled by Pakistan. And so that entire village, my great grandmother and so many of my family, they fled from that area. So there was something very hypnotic and very out of body of me standing in front of this gate and knowing that once upon a time it would have taken me right to where my family would have stayed. We would have lived. We would have never have left had kind of partition never happened. So that residual kind of like history was so really haunting, and it really was really visceral. And that experience was what I ended up channeling when creating this film. And so I wrote a script, and then I started putting together the video footage that I had shot. I invited two wonderful friends of mine, Selena Dillon, who is a performance artist and writer and interdisciplinary artist based in Toronto, and Simmerpreet Singh, who's a sound designer and musician based in California. And I gave the poem to Selena, and she did an audio recording of it. And then I gave it to Simmerpreet, who created the sound for it. And then the footage and the drawings and the artwork, I started learning how to work with Premiere Pro and then put it all together. So I'm really grateful to be sharing this film with you guys today.
Thank you, Jagdeep. So without further ado, we'll begin this shortly.
Oh Lahore, oh dear Lahore, don't you remember your Kashmiri Gate? How they built you so you could open us up, calling out our names. And inside of us, oh how this aroused us. We greedily dreamt of your valley, longing for a taste. Oh Lahore, oh dear Lahore, don't you remember your Kashmiri Gate? Don't you remember the way those conquerors passed through you once? Dressed in imperial glory, riding in bullock carts with domed canopies and sedan chairs, desperate to eat you up, wanting to seal your fate. Oh, but wasn't it those Frenchies that passed through the gate? No, wait. It was the Ingresis, but also the Mughals, Brahmins, Afghans, Sikhs. The gateway took them there so we could rip you apart. But yet, you still loved us because you gave and gave and gave. Oh Lahore, oh dear Lahore, don't you remember your Kashmiri Gate? You gave us those shalwalas, the soft pashmina embroidered butte, the twill silk tapestry weave. You gave us copper, silver, gold, and jewels, the paper mache, the lapis lazuli blue. You gave us walnut wood carved from thick trees with those jannad leaves, and we feasted. Oh, how we feasted on you, longing for your snow-dusted mountains awash in purple shades. And we feasted for your Sunamad Valley too. Srinagar, the city of sun, Pahalgam, the valley of shepherds, saffron fields, floating gardens swimming through wildflower meadows and yellow crocus blooms. We feasted with our lustful longing, and now we watch you burn, rot, and fade into gloom. Oh Lahore, oh dear Lahore, look at your Kashmir today. Look at how we've looted you, plundered you, oh how we've pillaged you. Long after the Punjabi bloodshed came and stained us. Long after Amrita painted 3 women and Amrita screamed toward us. Long after October 1947 ravaged you once more with hate. Where the Muzaffarabadi Chakoti crumbled into pieces. Where she was slaughtered behind the Sigbura willow groves, the cypress trees, and River Jhelum protecting her in vain. long after we turned your lush butte into cheap paisley. The once crystal waters of Lake Thul, polluted and filthy. Plum, apple, cherry, grapevine, pomegranate trees, wilting away. Oh, Lahore, oh, dear Lahore, look at your Kashmir today.
That's such a powerful film, and it's so moving. The music is so haunting, Jagdeep. I'd love to talk very broadly first about what drew you to this particular structure. And here we have an image of a beautiful photograph that you took of the Kashmir Gate. And I understand that, again, as you discussed earlier, that your family are from Kashmir. So there's an element of the autobiographical in this film, but there's also a larger historical narrative at play. And you've kind of mentioned this and touched upon this as well, but Kashmir, owing to its strategic location, it's been a region that has been fought over well before, the English and French arrived for hundreds of years. It's been partitioned since 1947, as you also mentioned, with both India and Pakistan laying claim to its land. And the region has been really heavily militarized since the 90s. And you reference its history as a gate from which colonizers passed. And I quote this from the poem that your narrator recites in the film. I knew it wasn't just those Frenchies, but the Angrezis, Mughals, Brahmins, Afghan Sikhs. And that's not the only history of Kashmir that you're telling here. One of, strife and militarization that the kind of things that characterize certain places outside of the US on the news. But, and it's not just one of colonization, but there's also another sort of history here, and I would love to know if you could talk a little bit more again about what this gate means to you and as something that's autobiographical, as you mentioned, if you could just touch a little bit more upon that, but also that historical significance in relation to colonization, but also in relationship to those experiences that you had when you were at your artist residency in Lahore.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Miriam. That's a great question. I think historically setting this piece kind of in a narrative beyond just like thinking about Kashmir through like the lens of individual group kind of like existing in silos, but really thinking about how Kashmir as like a geographical location has kind of been constantly claimed upon by not just one group, but many, many groups. So like, for example, the French, the Afghan, even the Sikh Empire in the 19th century, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Lahore was part of the Sikh Empire, and even he was kind of obsessed with this idea of wanting to claim Kashmir, wanting it for his own, going there, exploiting Kashmiri weavers, treating Kashmiris horribly, paying them nothing and forcing them to make beautiful, beautiful shawls that I saw when I went to Lahore. So on a kind of a historical level, and also now you think about 2019, Article 372 that was revoked in India, kind of stripping Kashmir of its autonomous identity, and how the current Indian administration is also now trying to kind of take claim of it and constantly just try to have a piece of it. And so Afghan Empire was doing that in the 16th and 17th centuries too. Obviously the French were going and exploiting Kashmiri weavers. And so thinking a lot about kind of looking at this history and as this place that people keep trying to get a piece of, not through one specific group, by multiple different groups, and how it's something that's ongoing. And then on a personal level, my family is thinking a lot about those family histories with Kashmir too. And, there's lines talking about the Muzaffarabadi Chakoti crumbling into pieces. That's a reference to thinking a lot about, the village that my grandfather was from, which was destroyed after 1947. Thinking about the woman hiding behind the Singhpura, the willow groves. That's also another kind of a family reference when I was collecting stories of family histories who lived through 1947 and families that were fleeing and hiding behind willow groves. And sadly, some people, like in many, many, many families during this time, losing loved ones too. So I really try to be really strategic in kind of constructing this poem kind of and having this balancing act between kind of drawing on references that were familial, but then rooting those familiar references in a more kind of larger global conversation around just desire and longing, or this kind of fantasy of this place. Obviously, John Milton's poem Paradise Lost was a huge influence for me. So was Parminder Chadha. She's a poet based in Britain, and her piece, South Hall, she wrote a poem about South Hall, kind of examining this neighborhood on the outskirts of West London and kind of looking at how it was kind of built in the 1950s and 60s by many people, actually many Punjabi families who were coming from Lahore as a result of partition, many African Caribbean families coming from the Caribbean and building this town of South Hall. So she wrote this poem looking at kind of her longing for South Hall, but not writing South Hall in kind of romanticized lens. So I drew a lot of inspiration from that poem. I drew a lot of inspiration from John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost. And then that's kind of where the poem started emerging from, and taking writing workshops last year and really trying to push myself and thinking about this film and expanding outside of my drawing, painting, and textile practice, and kind of encompassing something that isn't like a hierarchy of all these histories, but kind of has a semblance of something that resonates in many histories. So familial histories, geopolitical histories, histories that are current, and seeing what that would then look like as like a visual object, a visual medium. Yeah. And also being really inspired by like John Akamfra, Handsworth Songs, Black Audio Film Collective, William Kentridge's films, particularly with Handsworth Songs. I was really moved by the first time I saw that film. It felt like a tapestry. It felt like a collage. There were so many elements in the film that were using archival footage, audio recordings of people reciting poetry and spoken word, current shots that were kind of being taken across London and then kind of juxtaposing it together and creating that beautiful film. So Handsworth Songs was a huge influence, as was William Kentridge's films too, whose exhibition I got to see at the Yale Art Gallery in 2015.
Great. And you also said that you saw the John Akamfra, the Black Audio Film Collective, who, for those of you who don't know, Handsworth Songs was produced and directed by John Akamfra and Black Audio Film Collective in '86. Or it was released in '86. And we talked a lot about how, I think we could actually use it as a springboard to talk about process and how you created this film in a sense. Because for Black Audio Film Collective, for example, Handsworth Songs was a documentary that was meant to was about centered on the sort of Handsworth riots, or protests rather, of 1985. Handsworth is a borough, I believe, of Birmingham in the UK. And it was a documentary that kind of touched upon the Caribbean and Sikh communities in Handsworth and the protests that evolved from there. But what was really interesting about Handsworth Songs, and what is really similar to that in your film as well, is the way that they used documentary in a different way. Black Audio Film Collective, and I quote this actually, they wanted to find a structure and form to deconstruct the hegemonic voices of British television news roles. And they did that by showing, the apparatuses of reportage, but they also, to show audiences that what you see on screen is not necessarily the truth. And again, when we talk about, the strife of what's going on in Kashmir and what we see on the news, it's not always the people that are on the ground and what you see on the ground. It's completely different. And I think you and I both being first gen and sort of feeling that exile and loss, my dad is Iranian. And so, in the news, Iran has a very different way of being perceived through the lens of reportage than it does when you're on the ground and when you're with those people, right? Same with you being here in Pakistan. So I'd love you to talk about, the documentary, right? Because first off, I'd love you to kind of talk about, why did you, you switched from, you are still doing textile, but you are a textile artist. You're interested in textile and painting, of course, and this is your first film. So I'd love you to talk about a couple of things. What is it about the documentary form that appeals to you, and what about it doesn't? When we think about documentaries, for example, I think of like ethnographic films of the 50s and 60s of a French anthropologist pointing their lens and thinking in a different way about a people, and then we also think about Netflix documentaries where, for example, David Attenborough is basically telling us what we're seeing on the screen in real life. But your documentary, your film doesn't use the documentary form in that way. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about the documentary form, how it appeals to you, how do you use it? And maybe also, talk a little bit more about your process and the stop motion animation, which is also something that was really important in Handsworth Songs as well. And I'll show some stills and some images of the stop motion animation if you want to kind of talk about.
Absolutely. Well, it's such a great question. I think thinking a lot about the documentary, it's something I feel like this film kind of is trying to kind of encapsulate almost like larger themes of my work, which has always been thinking a lot about the archive and thinking about how the archive is something that I've always kind of been kind of fascinated by as a way to kind of trace histories of migration. And, over the years, like as kind of my, on a formal level, as I continue to build a skill set and like thinking a lot about like archival practices, I'm now also thinking a lot about as something that's not really fixed, something that's constantly like fluctuating. And so, I see it more and more as like a site of power, and also thinking about how I can kind of disrupt that kind of perceived notion of something being fixed or an archive being fixed, and kind of dismantle that kind of homogeneity and like use the archive and like use it as a way to recover heterogeneity. And then I also think about that, like how can the archive kind of reveal these hierarchies of power that are constantly playing out all the time, like whether that's through geography, through class, through gender, through caste, through race. And that kind of lends me to think about the archive, the documentary elements of the archive as something that is constantly moving and flowing. And then, like John Acampra, I mean, there's a quote that he has that I've always been obsessed with, and he says like the archive requires a special poignancy because it's like one of the only spaces that's dedicated to the memorial. And so there's very few tangible memorials that say you have been here and you exist. And so the archive is important because it's one of the only spaces in which the memorial attests to your kind of existence. And that quote is kind of like permanently etched in my psyche because I thought about that so much when I was in Lahore and I saw the gate, and I didn't see the gate as something that was fixed or frozen in time. I saw it as something that was it was a residual fragment of like these kind of really kind of disembodied histories.
As a memorial as well?
I did, yeah, I definitely saw it as a memorial. For multiple reasons, I think I saw Lahore as a site of a memorial for me personally, because I know that like, my uncle lived in Lahore for many years. He was from Kashmir, and he would go back and forth from Kashmir to Lahore all the time. He was an accountant. And during 1947, he barely survived. He was almost murdered, like hundreds of thousands of millions of people that had to flee. And so there is that kind of familial history with Lahore too. And then seeing the gate and knowing that it would have just taken me right to this Pakistani village where my family was from, I couldn't help but not think about that when I was standing there. It was a really moving experience, and it really made me think a lot about, again, the gate as being as a memorial that for me wasn't frozen in time. It was something that almost was vibrating, and I kept going there because it kept kind of pushing me and forcing me to think about my present moment in Lahore, which wasn't just rooted in that moment right now, but something that was constantly moving back and forth between the future and the past. And so I brought a film camera with me, and I started taking 35mm photographs of the gate, which I had never done before because I don't really take photographs like as a source material, thinking about my practice, and then taking a tripod and taking a video camera, and then just starting to capture the footage of this gate that was alive became really important to me too. And so that residency and the artists that I was around and the community that I built there was so moving, and it really gave me the kind of freedom to think about the archive and the memorial as things that were living outside of just kind of the aspect of painting, drawing, and textiles, which I was kind of working in and still working in, but thinking about how this memorial can exist through writing, through poetry, through film, through stop motion animation, through video, through sound, through music. So yeah.
That's great. And so this is a great kind of springboard. I want to have time so we can talk about your textile practice and the tapestries that you've created. And feel free to tell me if you'd like me to move to a different one. But we could talk about Filthy Imperial Glory. Now, this tapestry shows the gate, the Kashmir Gate, and the photograph there was really similar to this tapestry. And I like how you talk about the memorial, this idea of archives. And we've talked about the archive sort of being it's fragmented in a lot of ways, especially certain voices and certain histories are very much fragmented when we think about archival record, what we have in existence. And one of the things that I would like to kind of think about is maybe, again, maybe we should talk first about your practice in terms of textile, and tell us why the textile and why embroidery is so important to you. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about the materiality of these tapestries and what is significant about the materiality and the process with these particular works.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with the longing for textile is something that's very natural. Like in my house, for example, we have a Kashmiri shawl that's over 200 years old. And it's a family heirloom. And Kashmir is a place where there's so much kind of physical and then material beauty that comes out of it. Like the paper mache, like the things that I talk about in the film, the jewelry, the copper, the silver, the gold, the pashmina, the shawls, the embroidery, all of that kind of the incredible artisans that are there. And, in my own family too, I know, not with my mother's generation, but the generation before that, we're all skilled embroiderers and weavers and spinning pashmina and silk and wool. And so that kind of longing and connection to kind of build this skill set in spinning and weaving and sewing and natural dye and embroidery just happened really naturally. And then obviously the kind of the complicated histories of the Kashmiri shawl, it's one of the most beautiful textiles in the world, which is why it's been always so revered after, and why the industry has been a place that's constantly been in flux. Emperors have always longed for these shawls. And I think about the floral motifs, the plants and the vegetables, and the umbi, which is a tree of life motif. And if you go to the Fidan tapestry, you can see the woman in the garden wearing the Fidan, which is a traditional Kashmiri garment. And then at the bottom is the tree of life, which is known as umbi. And the embroidery was later stolen from Kashmir and co-opted as the paisley design. So you see that style a lot, called the paisley. So with this tapestry, Fidan, and then also with Paradise Lost of the group sitting in the garden, just kind of thinking a lot about kind of learning these embroidery techniques, the umbi embroidery, the fulkari embroidery, learning spinning, learning weaving, and then kind of juxtaposing building and kind of holding myself accountable to actually learn the labor of these textile practices and how long it takes to make. Like, this took me almost 3 months, embroidering it all by hand, and then working with the weaver and spinning the fiber. And then similar with the Kashmir Gate tapestry too, it was really important for me to kind of touch, not only just kind of learn about the histories of these textile practices and how they've been kind of just completely altered through years of globalization, and also kind of ways in which weavers and embroiderers have been exploited, but then also not just think about that history, but also hold myself accountable and like learn this craft, use my hands to learn this craft. So that has kind of been my kind of connection to the textile practice, is a combination of learning the craft, taking the workshops, taking spinning, taking embroidery, taking weaving, going to Pakistan, learning about Kashmiri embroidery, Punjabi embroidery, and then also kind of then using these skill sets and putting this history and translating into a material quality. Yeah.
And I'd like to show, this is the image of the shawl that is in your family.
Yeah, so the one on the left is it's like one of my prized possessions. It's a shawl that we have. It's over 200 years old. It's incredibly fragile. It's actually in my closet, but I keep it wrapped up. I want to get it framed one day. And then the image on the right was a beautiful experience I had in Lahore, where the artist I was with, Resham Saeed and Roma and Shabnam and Jawad and Sana and Saira, all these incredible artists. They were so kind of important and so inspirational for me to think about, really kind of helped me kind of connect to my roots in a way that I had never experienced before. And on my last night in Lahore, Resham told me about this man named Zafar Saib, who's a Kashmiri embroidery artist. He was in his 80s and he has encyclopedic knowledge of Kashmiri textiles and shawl making and weaving and embroidery, and incredible embroidery expert. And she was like, I'm going to put you in touch with his family, go to his house, go talk to him. He's going to be so excited to see you. So the artist that I was with, Dale, took me to his house. It was the last night before we were going to fly out to Canada. And that's a photo of his son. He's sitting in the background on the sofa, but his son, who was showing me these incredible shawls. And I was like, I had my phone with me and I was showing him images of the tapestries I was embroidering. And he was so inspiring. He took my hands in his and he was like, you are an artist. I'm going to train you. I'm going to help you teach these skills so you can preserve them, pass them on. And as soon as I got back to Canada, I started working on a grant and I wanted to go back to Lahore and study with him. And then unfortunately in June, he passed away. And it was really heartbreaking for me. I was really saddened and heartbroken by learning about his passing. And obviously these things are out of our control, but it just made me become that much more, there was a sense of urgency in knowing that these craft practices are all dying. And so that photo is something that I like constantly think about and look at and realize that like when this people are dying, these craft practices are dying with them.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you are trying to evoke and relearn that knowledge that was passed down through generations and generations and is unfortunately being lost, today? Talk a little bit more about that and maybe in relationship to some of the imagery in your tapestries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most simplest way that I'm trying to do that is just by learn the craft, like taking the actual workshops. And I have like 2 pounds of cotton and silk and wool that I've been working with to take the fiber and slowly working with spindles and turning it into thread. I have a sewing machine where I've been learning sewing over the last few months. I've been taking a lot of weaving workshops and I have a plan to continue building more of my skill set in weaving. Embroidery as well has been something that has become so important to me now. Natural dye as well is something that I've been learning too. So just the simplest kind of answer to that question is just like holding myself accountable and like learning these skills and building and learning as much as I can. And with the Fulkari, I feel for the first time this year, a sense of kind of confidence that I've been able to really, over the last couple of years, really now build the skill set, because the fulkari is also a type of embroidery practice that's becoming completely decimated. And so knowing that and Kashmiri, the umbi, the paisley, the chain stitch, and the umbi patterning, knowing that I now know something, that just feels so good. And I think as artists, we're constantly radically dreaming all the time. And I have a big dream of wanting to live in Kashmir for a year to 2 years and just live with Kashmiri weavers and live with paper mache artists. I know my mom's brother still lives there, and so I have some family there, and just immerse myself in the craft and just learn as much as I can. Yeah.
And there's an image of some fulkari and a detail of filthy imperial glory, and you can kind of see that here. I want to talk a little bit more about, we kind of talked about the archive, and I did touch upon this really briefly, and you mentioned this idea of the fragment. And I think, now we're just kind of talking, and just thinking about the symbolism of the gate. But, you talked about it as being a memorial, but we also think of it as a fragment, as a ruin. And I see a lot of strong parallels between this idea of a fragment of something that is evidence of a past, but it's also evidence of its eventual disappearance, right? A ruin, for example, it shows that it's maybe not taken care of as well as it should be. And we think about that with the gate. And I know we were talking about, you have these sort of images of advertisements on the front of these gates, but I also think about this in terms of your textile practice. And also, you mentioned, the shawl that's in your family, and I'm just going to go back quickly. The shawl that's in your family, it is a material remnant too. And so are the processes from which it was created, as you mentioned. And so it's just really interesting to think about your work in that way, and to think about this idea of the fragment and the remnant in that way as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think kind of thinking about these material practices as remnants and as fragments is really at the core of what's been driving me to learn textiles. And then obviously with Lahore, with this film, thinking a lot about how that film could kind of encapsulate those kind of material histories too. So, throughout the film, I talk about the silk carpets, I talk about the copper, the silver, the gold, the paper mache, the lapis lazuli, the walnut wood, the chinar trees with the leaves, and really trying to use language as a way to kind of evoke these material crafts and histories, and also thinking a lot about the shawl and the fragments, and then the embroidery technique, and kind of understanding the labor of how they kind of encompass all of these histories. And I feel like, the shawl, it encompasses many, many histories, and holds them in a way in which these histories don't feel kind of hierarchical, but kind of just exist through the fiber, through the embroidery, through the fragments that are dyed, through the patterns of the flowers and the birds and the umbis and the trees. And because so many of with the Kashmiri shawl and also with the fulkari, so many of the patterns that people would embroider would be of the landscape, of the trees and the mountains, and Gulmarg and Srinagar and Belgaum and Baramulla, all of these villages in Kashmir. And so it's such a visual, it's almost like a map. It's like these kind of conceptual maps, which people have also kind of have always referred to the fulkari as, and arguably I would say the Kashmiri shawl too is a map. There is another Kashmiri shawl that's in the collection of the Victorian Albert Museum, which is the entire map of Srinagar, which is a city where my mom's sister lived for many, many, many years before also eventually leaving and coming to Canada. And I remember seeing that Kashmiri shawl too, and seeing this map that was spread across it. And so Kashmiri artisans I feel like they've always been very conceptual with how they kind of create these incredible works of beauty, because they're so strategic with kind of what is embroidered onto there. The umbi, the tree of life, it has all of these symbolic motifs that I'm constantly trying to think about and tap into when I'm also learning these materials and these ways of working.
That's great. I think that we now maybe should wrap up a little bit so that we have time for Q&A from our audience. And I do have a couple of questions already lined up, and feel free to ask Jagdeep any question that you'd like to know more about his in terms of his practice and in terms of the gate. Jagdeep, there's a question here about archives. How much can you rely on an archive in an age of censorship, especially in today's age where we can easily establish the fact that every document that goes into the record is censored?
That's a great question. And I think with this film in particular, I feel like John and Compra really gave me the permission to kind of build and create my own archive. And that's kind of what I did with making Lahore, going and taking those photographs, documenting that footage, sitting with all of this material that I had created. All of a sudden, there was this incredible possibility that I was now kind of in charge and in control of all of this material that I had gathered of the Kashmiri Gate in Lahore. And with that archive, I think it really kind of helped me realize that there are projects that I can work on and archives that I can create where I can be responsible for questions around censorship, for questions around erasure, for questions around saying, as John Akamfa says, like, I have been here. And so with this film in particular, it was really liberating, I think is how I would say it, to kind of build my own archive and be in control of the narrative and not worry about anything about permission or censorship, and just really kind of, then also be responsible with that archive, and really try to kind of create a work of art that speaks to kind of heterogeneity, which I think many artists and many people are trying to kind of grapple when thinking about archives. So yeah, thank you for that question.
And it kind of goes into, I mean, we didn't really get into too much discussion about it, but we did talk about colonial fantasy and how that sort of plays a role in your work. This isn't necessarily colonial fantasy, but I just wanted to show some works in our collection that showcase the Kashmir shawl. And these are two works that are on right now on display on our fourth floor. And hopefully someday soon we'll be able to see these works in person. But, you know, you kind of think of the colonial fantasy in a relationship to what an archive does show and depict. And also, I think you do touch upon that as well in the film, and also in terms of your practice, this idea of colonial fantasy. And it would be great if you could maybe tie that into this idea of the archive and the censorship behind the archive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Kashmir Gate, you know, I tried to really kind of hint at that idea of fantasy in the poem. And so, you know, the gate they passed through once, dressed in robes of imperial glory, riding in bullock carts with domed canopies, sedan chairs, desperate to cut you open, desperate to eat your fate. I think a lot about the line that I said, you know, the many people that were going to Kashmir, they went there so they could rip Kashmir apart, but yet Kashmir as a place, geographical place, loved them so selflessly, gave and gave and gave. And so that idea of fantasy is something I think with the Kashmir Gate, you know, I'm not kind of designating or kind of, you know, as I mentioned, like using it as like divvying up groups and silos, but really looking at history through kind of complex, messy, nuanced ways, and how each different like groups of people have constantly tried to claim Kashmir as their own. And so the idea of kind of colonial fantasy isn't projected onto one specific person or one specific group of people, but it's kind of is like siphoned off into many different groups of people. That idea of the fantasy is then kind of, it's cut apart and it's kind of like sliced open. It's looking at it in a really messy lens, which I think is really important.
So it would also be good, I think we should talk a little bit more. You know, we didn't get a chance to really talk as much about your textiles and this particular work of art, which is a mixed media on paper. And there's a question in the audience about your transition from working with charcoal earlier in your career to what you're doing now. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your earlier practice in terms of charcoal and work like this and your future work.
That's a great question. I mean, with this piece too, I also want to do a painting of the quilt or a drawing of the quilt. And then I feel pretty confident in the skill set that I've built in sewing. And so I took a bunch of fabric that I naturally dyed, and then I cut them into kind of squares, and then I sewed a quilt border around it. And then I put that painting, and then I batted it with some batting, and then I turned it into a quilt. And so this paint piece is called On Sunday I Went to the Kashmir Gate. And it has elements of charcoal in there. It has elements of a drawing aspect in there. There are qualities in this painted quilt that kind of evokes my practice with drawing. And similarly to the film, the animation, many stills in that film, you know, the part of Amrita Pritam's face as I evoke her poem, Ode to Watershaw, or Amrita Shergill in her studio painting, or the scenes of Kashmir's kind of map becoming kind of discombobulated. Like all of the material of those stills were kind of me kind of harkening back to my training working as a draftsman and continuing to bring that skill set into my work even today. Drawing will always be a part of my practice and continues to kind of guide me as I think about writing, as I think about textiles, as I think about film and video.
We have another question from the audience. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been such a rich presentation. And Jagdeep, can you talk about the notion of humility in relation to your work? When you were at RISD, for example, you sometimes talked about humility in relation to drawing, and the audience member is wondering how that idea has continued to inform your practice as you expand into other media.
That's such a great question. I think with this film, I think the idea of humility comes from the fact that like I'm responsible for holding myself accountable with what kind of narrative I present of this gate. And so it's not the narrative I'm not doing is like, you're right and I'm like, you're wrong and I'm right. Or like this group is bad and this group is good. But every community, every history has some faults or some flaws, and kind of leading Kashmir to constantly being a site that's kind of being contested over, including, for example, the Sikh Empire. And like my family, we're Kashmiri, geographically, culturally, we're Kashmiri, but then like our religious affiliation has always been like as Sikhs, and thinking a lot about, like, I did not know, for example, about like the brutal ways in which Sikhs in the Sikh Empire was exploiting Kashmir. And so, that's a history that I'm trying to hold myself accountable for, and also thinking a lot about not painting Kashmir as like a site that is also constantly being contested over, but also a site that where people live and they laugh and they live their lives and they dance and they hang out, and it's people are still living their lives there, and my family's still living their life there. My family was just there 2 summers ago for my cousin's wedding, and although the wedding was in lockdown and so forth, they were still happy there. And so kind of also thinking a lot about, I guess, that humility with this piece is kind of really holding myself accountable to kind of painting or portraying a history that isn't homogenous, but really, really heterogeneous. Yeah, and that's kind of how I've been thinking a lot about. But the only way to do that is by pointing the finger at yourself and your flaws too, when kind of thinking about how to hold yourself. And also the humility is also kind of evoked through me thinking a lot about, like, I don't want to just look at pretty photos of Kashmiri shawls and kind of daydream and long at these pretty textiles or look at the shawl, but I want to actually also go and like learn these skill sets. So, spending 3 years now building skills in weaving and embroidery and spinning and sewing and making so many mistakes and constantly making mistakes. The first time I was spinning silk and cotton, it was horrible. Like my threads were like so gross. They're coming up. Or the first time I was sewing and embroidering, it wasn't working. And sticking with that and staying patient with building that skill set has also kind of held me accountable and making me think a lot about that idea of humility, which is something that I'm trying to kind of actively kind of portray both in Lahore and in the subsequent work I'm doing around the gate, which is physically actually using my hand and using textiles and these histories of textiles and of Kashmiri embroidery and Punjabi Fulkari embroidery, and then making them with my own hands and learning the skill set.
And I see that, you want to talk about histories, right? And it's not about some canonical narrative of a history, of a monolithic narrative of what, again, what we see on the news, for example. And it goes back to when we were talking about documentary as a form and how you don't have the sort of monolithic voice that's kind of telling us what we should be seeing and what we should be thinking about. And I see that multi-layered kind of, in your practice in terms of the film, again, thinking about Hands Were Songs and how that was an inspiration to you. And this multi-layered, histories is not just something monolithic. And so you can kind of see that, I think, in the, the materiality of your film and your textile making, the sort of layering the threads, for example, of layering meaning, and especially here with some of these stills that we see as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some other questions from the audience. We have a question. I was also struck by the video editing of repetition of forward and reverse walking through the gate, which evoked for the audience member the repetitions of history's dispossessions. Similarly, the simple but beautiful animation was so evocative of history's layers of violence across time, which we just sort of mentioned. A simple technological choice that really impresses these long and complex processes of political and historical violence. Can you say something about these methodologies of the film?
That's such a great question. I think in a really simple way, I'm just gonna reference, like, I think William Kentridge was an artist who really gave me the permission to think about the hand and the element of mark making, which is, I think, really important to film and video, and then kind of how to evoke that and how to evoke using drawing and using mixed media to kind of take the script of the film and give a narrative and a visual kind of narrative to the words that were kind of being presented and spoken by so beautifully by Selena. And then similarly with the gate, the figures walking back and forth is kind of thinking a lot about time. There's an artist, Chitra Ganesh, who always says that time is a spiral and it moves in cycles. It's never linear. And I think those are things I was thinking a lot about with the gate too. And I feel like with Simranpreet's music and with Selena's voice, them kind of bringing on that layering into the film, I think really create many elements in the film in which each piece is almost like a puzzle, and each piece eventually just started fitting perfectly together. So Selena's voice, Simran's music, the drawings, the Premiere Pro editing I was doing, the footage I was shooting. And ultimately, I think at its core, I feel really good about the fact that this film hopefully can kind of resonate and create a sense of time that is being constantly sliced open and constantly a spiral, as Chitra says. So yeah, thank you for your question.
You also mentioned a lot of great sources, again, of inspiration from textile making, Kashmiri embroidery and the Fulkari, filmmaking. We've talked about Hands Were Songs, poetry, for example. Are there any touchstones for you in photography?
So many. Margaret Bourke-White comes to mind initially. I thought of her so much when I was in Lahore because she was there. She captured those really iconic historical photographs of the partition of India, and she also captured the photographs of life in Punjab before 1947. Like, she has these stunning photographs of Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims and Christians all kind of mingling and together in like the Anarkali Bazaar and the old walled city of Lahore. So her work comes to mind immediately. I mean, there's many other photographers that I'm always thinking a lot about, but I think when I think a lot specifically about this project, I think about Margaret Bourke-White more than anybody else. She really inspired me.
Another question here, and we talked about archiving. We've talked about the archive. One of the audience members would like to know if you consider your artistic practice a form of archiving in itself. And we have kind of talked about this, but maybe if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of archive. I know we mentioned that you think of the archive and you in terms of research. And a lot of your work revolves around research of weaving and embroidery in this sense as well. But do you think of your art as a form of archival?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I do, and I also think a lot about like building a career as an archivist too. When I was in graduate school, I chose not to teach in my second year. And I did this like life-changing fellowship at the RISD Museum where I was kind of a curatorial, I was like an assistant to the curators in the Department of Prints and Drawings and Photographs. And I worked with an amazing colleague and friend, Amelia Mikevicius, and I worked with Jan Howard and Brittany Salisbury. And I also would help out and hang out with Kate Irvin, who is a curator of costume and textiles at the RISD Museum too. And during that job, like I actually formally built a skill set in learning about Museum Plus and software programs and how to take care of prints and drawings and how to accession work and, how to curate an exhibition. And I also worked at the RISD library with Ellen Petrates. And I spent a whole summer archiving all the RISD thesis books. And then over the last 2 years, I just finished a 2-year work fellowship with the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, where I was responsible for over 700 lectures. And I learned how to like do transcription work and indexing and summary and creating index lectures and building a database where I digitize and do summary work for hundreds and hundreds of artist lectures. So on a formal level, like archival work is something that I just really like to do. Like I always still think a lot about, I still have this desire of maybe wanting to go back to school and doing a master's in archival studies, library science. So just in general, it's something that's always in my head. I volunteer for the 1947 Partition Archive, where I've recorded stories and my members of my family who lived through the partition of India. And, I just think about the fact that I'm so glad that I did that, because just in the last 2 years, two of my uncles whose stories I recorded, they're both passed away. And I'm so glad that I preserved their stories. So both on like a formal professional level, I love doing archival work. It's a skill set that I want to keep doing. Like I want to keep seeking out experiences and work study fellowships and do programs and coursework that can formally continue to give me permission to build my training as an archivist. And then obviously as an artist too, it's just having that kind of skill set, that formal skill set, which is something that is continuing to develop. It will continue to inform my artistic practice too. Whitechapel Gallery also comes to mind. They do that amazing book, Documents of Contemporary Art. And I have the one on the archive, and there's so many artists in that book living and working right now that are working with archives,
Right.
Roxy Media Collective, John Acampra, Renee Green, like the list goes on and on. Emily Jasir, Latoya B. Fraser, like there's so many artists. So I'm a part of this community of artists, intergenerational artists that are working with the archive. Yeah.
And you're talking, and Barbara Walker, for example, who we have some beautiful works in our collections of those with the archive as well. But I think, I was interested because you were talking about cataloging and digital archiving and sort of the processes of actually archiving material. Does any of that factor into your work, or do you think about any of that and maybe some of your future work?
Yeah, definitely. It does. I mean, I think a lot about how the formal skill sets that I've learned from all these kind of work study place or fellowships I've been doing, how that kind of informs how I think about taking care of my own artistic practice and treating it like an archive. Another project that I've been doing is a good friend of mine and I are working on a grant to get funding to digitize an archive of a friend of ours, Satinder Chauhan, who built an incredible archive in the early 2000s of Punjabi farmers and their experiences in Punjab. And that archive consists of 700 photographs, over 21 hours of taped interviews with farmers, video recordings, sound recordings. And she gave the entire archive to me. She gave it to me. She said, I want you to take it. I want you to take care of it. So that's another archive that we're also just kind of taking care of. And so it's just a part of my practice. It's not just a part of my practice as an artist, but the archive is also just like I think how I'm like conducting my life as a person too, constantly thinking about history and how to preserve history. And because we all know history is so homogenous, and every day things are going to be left out.
Right.
Stories
And
are going to be left out.
actually, you know,
Right
I
now,
think
there are
that
stories being left out. We just won't know. Yeah.
absolutely. And we definitely forget more than we remember, even as, you know,
Yeah.
humans, you know, the act of remembering, for example. And so even the material evidence of the archive very much reflects that. And especially, you know, this sort of lack of knowledge of this loss of knowledge of some of these textile practices that you're very interested in learning and hoping that you can continue in your own practice. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and I maybe one more time for one more quick question. And somebody has asked that beyond the Kashmir Gate, what, if any, other architectural considerations enter into your work? Are there any other sort of architectural structures or buildings that you might be interested in thinking of in terms of how you think about the gate? And someone else had asked the question, and if you're interested in the Kashmir Gate in Delhi.
Yeah, I am interested in the Kashmir Gate in Delhi. That's an architectural site that I definitely want to visit. I also want to visit all the old kind of Havelis and the houseboats and the houses in Kashmir and Baramulla and Srinagar too. That's a dream I have of mine. You know, the houses that the Kashmiri Pandits used to live in, the villages that Kashmiri Sikhs used to live in. A huge part of my grandfather's village is I know decimated, but you know I have heard that like a portion of his house remains and it's now a school. So that architectural site would be really interesting to see one day. In the past, architecture has always been a part of my practice. You know, whether it's like visiting old Sikh temples across North America or the Punjabi Delhi in New York, or you know the Rex Theatre, a cinema in Vancouver, like or the sites across Britain, the Southall Black Sisters, the town of Southall, the old train stations. It's architecture is always on my head, always.
We are almost out of time, Jagdeep, and I want to thank you for
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that we were able to
Me
get
too.
to know each other throughout the last months. And
thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks Courtney and Linda and everybody.
And I would also like, before everyone goes, just to announce that our next online program will be on Wednesday, February 10th at noon again with Jason Farago, who is the art critic for the New York Times, and he'll deliver this year's Norma Litton lecture. Again, Jagdeep, thank you so much for such a great conversation, and thank you everyone to our audience as well for joining us. Have a good weekend.